Nancy Ben stepped into her home, expecting a quick stop to grab her forgotten credit card. Instead, she froze. A pair of small shoes near the door. Voices. Low, muffled. A sound she couldn't mistake. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she moved down the hall. The door to the bedroom was open just enough. A glimpse inside was all it took. A flash of movement. A familiar face. Disloyalty so deep it stole the breath from her chest. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She reached for the top drawer. Her husband's gun. Her fingers wrapped around the grip. A creak from the floor beneath her. The voices stopped. A shift in the bed. Someone turned. Nancy stepped forward. Then, gunfire. Before we go further, subscribe to our channel to get updated on similar crime stories just like this one. Together, we can become voices of the voiceless. Nancy Ben was the kind of teacher parents trusted. At Clearwater Middle School, she wasn't just an educator. She was a mentor, a guide, and to some students, a second mother. She loved her students. She treated them like her own children. If one of them needed extra help, she'd stay late. If a student had trouble at home, she'd listen. Nancy cared. Outside the classroom, Nancy's life appeared just as admirable. She and her husband, Steve Ben, lived in a quiet Florida neighborhood. Well-maintained lawns, kids riding bikes, the kind of place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. They had been married for nearly 10 years, a couple who seemed solid. Steve, a former Marine turned construction foreman, had a reputation as a friendly, hard-working man. Steve was charming, always helpful. If you needed a hand with something, he was the guy who'd show up with a toolbox, but we never really knew what went on inside their home. Together, they played the part of a happy middle-class couple. Smiling photos from vacations, anniversary posts on social media, hand in hand at neighborhood gatherings. But perfection is often a mask. Nancy's job meant long hours and Steve's meant early mornings and late nights. Somewhere in between, the cracks had started to form. Then there was Sandra. Sandra Lewis was 14, bright, well-mannered, and eager to learn. She was one of Nancy's top students, the kind who stayed after class to ask questions, who actually enjoyed homework. When her grades started slipping in math, Nancy offered to tutor her after school. 1 or 2 sessions a week quickly turned into a regular routine. Soon, Sandra was spending more time at the Ben household, sometimes helping Nancy organize lesson plans, sometimes just sitting at the kitchen table while she graded papers. Sandra was one of those students who actually liked school. She wanted to do well, and Mrs. Ben really believed in her. To most, Sandra's extra time at the Ben home was just another example of Nancy going above and beyond for her students. But to Steve, it was something else entirely. Sandra was young, innocent, vulnerable, and Steve had been watching. She always looked up to Mrs. Ben, but Mr. Ben, something about him always felt off. He gave her too much attention, asked her too many questions. It just didn't seem right. No one thought much of it at first. Steve was friendly, maybe a little too friendly, but nothing outright alarming. He'd offer Sandra a soda when she came over, ask about her favorite music, joke with her in a way that blurred the line between casual and inappropriate. But then the looks lingered too long, the compliments became a little too personal, the small talk edged into something else. Sandra's mother, unaware of the shift, was just grateful her daughter had a teacher who cared. Nancy was like a mentor to her. She trusted her. Sandra's mother trusted Nancy as well. What no one realized was that Sandra was not safe, and Nancy, she never saw it coming. February 14th. A day of love, trust, and celebration. For Nancy Ben, it was supposed to be just that. She had left home in the late afternoon, heading to a nearby supermarket for a few last-minute Valentine's Day items. She had plans. Nothing extravagant, just a simple dinner with her husband. She was seen entering the store, scanning through the aisles, picking out chocolates, wine, maybe even a card. There was no urgency, no worry, just a woman on a routine shopping trip, completely unaware of the storm brewing back home. Back at the house, Sandra Lewis was making her way to the Ben residence. She had bought a small bouquet of flowers for her teacher, a token of appreciation for all the help she had received. She knocked. The door opened. It wasn't Nancy standing there. It was Steve. Steve Ben had been waiting for an opportunity, and now here it was. Sandra alone, his wife, out of the house, their neighbor recounted. I remember seeing the girl walk up to the house. She had flowers. It looked sweet, innocent. I never thought anything of it. Sandra hesitated at the door, expecting Nancy, not Steve. Buddy smiled, stepping aside. Nancy's not here right now, he said, but you can wait inside. She won't be long. Sandra hesitated, but then she stepped in. The door closed behind her. Inside, Steve was relaxed. Too relaxed. He offered her a soda, asked about school, asked if she had a boyfriend yet. His voice was casual, easy, like this was just another conversation. What started as light talk turned into something else, compliments that felt too personal. His hand brushing against hers as he handed her the drink. He told her she was beautiful, more mature than other girls her age. Sandra shifted uncomfortably, but Steve was persistent. He made promises, things that to a 14-year-old sounded tempting. You're special. No one understands you like I do. I can give you things no one else can. The words came smoothly, calculated. He had been waiting for this moment. Sandra resisted at first, but Steve was older, stronger, convincing. The walls around her crumbled bit by bit. And then she gave in. What neither of them knew was that Nancy was already on her way back home. At the supermarket checkout, she had reached for her wallet, only to realize she had left her credit card at home. It was a minor inconvenience, nothing more. She would just run back, grab it, and be on her way. She pulled into the driveway, expecting nothing out of the ordinary, until she saw them. Sandra's shoes. Small, pink, placed neatly outside the front door. Nancy frowned. Sandra wasn't supposed to be there today. She stepped out of her car. A sound drifted through the slightly opened window. Soft laughter. A voice, familiar but different. A tone Nancy had never heard from her husband before. And then, something else. A low moan. Nancy's heart pounded, her hands clenched. She moved toward the door, slowly, carefully. It wasn't fully shut, just enough for her to push it open. She stepped inside. The house was quiet except for the muffled voices down the hall. She moved forward step by step. The bedroom door wasn't closed. It was cracked open just enough. She saw a movement, a shadow, and then she saw them. A moment stretched into eternity. Steve, Sandra, the bed, the betrayal. Nancy couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then something inside her snapped. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She reached for the top drawer. Her husband's gun. Her fingers wrapped around the grip. A creak from the floor beneath her. The voices stopped. A shift in the bed. Someone turned. Nancy stepped forward. Then gunfire. Shot her husband 9 times on different parts of his body. She even called 911 by herself, and by the time officers arrived, the house was silent. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. The scene inside was chaotic. Blood pooling on the floor, shattered glass, overturned furniture. Nancy Ben stood in the middle of it all, the gun still clutched in her hands. Her breathing was ragged, her face void of expression. Officers shouted commands, but she didn't move, didn't resist. "Drop the weapon, hands where we can see them." She complied. The gun hit the floor with a dull thud. Sandra was on the floor, curled up near the wall, trembling. She was unharmed, but paralyzed with shock. A child, thrust into a nightmare she never saw coming. And Steve Ben? He wasn't moving. Multiple gunshot wounds, one male, unresponsive, paramedics on scene. The crime scene was preserved, marked with evidence tags, 9 spent casings, 9 holes in Steve's body. Nancy was taken into custody without resistance. A metal chair scraped against the floor as Nancy sat across from detectives, her wrists cuffed. "He betrayed me," she said, her voice steady. "He ruined a child's life. I didn't think. I just shot." Her words were matter of fact. No hysteria, no regret. Detectives pushed for more, but Nancy had nothing else to say. She didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't plead self-defense. She only repeated the same thing: "I just shot." For investigators, the evidence was clear. This wasn't a single shot fired in the heat of the moment. This wasn't self-defense. She emptied the clip. 9 rounds. This was an execution. Sandra was taken in for questioning the same night. She was shaken, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this," she said. "I didn't know what to do." She recounted the moments before the shooting, the way the door creaked, the instant of horror when she saw Nancy's reflection in the mirror. "She didn't say anything," Sandra whispered. "She just lifted the gun." Then, gunfire. Steve had barely turned before the first bullet hit. Sandra had scrambled to the floor, hands over her head. She remembered the flashes, the deafening sounds, the way Steve's body jerked with each shot. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stayed frozen until the shooting stopped. Nancy's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. News cameras lined the street in front of the Ben home. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering among themselves. Was Nancy a grieving wife pushed beyond her breaking point, or was she something else? Local teacher Nancy Ben arrested for the fatal shooting of her husband Steve Ben. Authorities confirmed that she fired 9 rounds. Sources say the victim was found in the couple's bedroom with a 14-year-old girl present at the scene. Prosecutors are calling this a calculated act of violence. Social media erupted. Some called Nancy a hero, a woman who took justice into her own hands after uncovering something horrific. Others saw her as a murderer, a woman who let rage consume her. This case is unique because while the emotional element is understandable, legally speaking, this was a homicide. The number of shots fired makes it difficult to argue temporary insanity or self-defense. Nancy Ben was charged with first-degree murder, and then the trial began. This was not an act of self-defense. This was not a single moment of passion. Nancy Ben had time to walk away, time to think, time to stop. But she didn't. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who snapped and executed her husband in cold blood. They highlighted the forensic evidence, how Steve was shot multiple times, even after he had fallen. She acted out of rage. This was murder, plain and simple. The defense had a different story. Nancy wasn't a killer. She was a betrayed wife, a woman who walked in on something unspeakable. She wasn't thinking, she reacted, the defense attorney argued. This was a crime of passion fueled by betrayal and the instinct to protect a child. Was she justified, or was she dangerous? This case has divided the nation. Some call her a vigilante. Others say she's no different from any other killer. As the trial continued, one thing became clear. No one could agree on who Nancy Ben really was. A grieving wife? A woman scorned? A murderer? The verdict was approaching, and the world was watching. The air in the courtroom was heavy, thick with anticipation. Every breath, every rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats felt amplified. Cameras flashed, pens hovered over notepads. The nation was waiting. Nancy Ben sat still, her hands clasped in front of her. Across from her, the prosecution team remained poised, their expressions unreadable. The jury had spent days deliberating, weighing the evidence, debating what justice should look like in a case like this. The judge entered. The room stood. Then, silence. In the case of the state versus Nancy Ben on the charge of first-degree murder, how does the jury find the defendant? The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, unfolded the paper in her hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant—" A pause. Nancy's face remained blank. Sandra, seated near the back, clutched her hands together. Family members of both the victim and the accused braced themselves. Then, the verdict. For some, it was a moment of justice. For others, it was a miscarriage of it. The reaction was immediate, gasps, a few quiet sobs. Across the courtroom, expressions ranged from relief to quiet outrage. The judge thanked the jury for their service. The gavel struck. It was over. One juror, a man in his 60s, spoke about the weight of their decision. This wasn't easy. You have to separate emotion from law, and that's not always possible. but we followed the evidence. Another juror admitted, "Some of us saw her as a victim, others saw her as a killer. We had to find a middle ground." But could there truly be a middle ground in a case like this? For Sandra, the trial's end wasn't closure. It was just another chapter in a story she never wanted to be a part of. She had spent months in therapy, trying to process what happened that night. The gunshots, the silence afterward, the weight of being at the center of something she never saw coming. Reporters hounded her for statements. Some blamed her for what had happened, calling her reckless, a homewrecker. Others saw her as another victim, a teenager caught in the storm of someone else's broken marriage. But no matter how the public saw her, one thing remained the same. Sandra would never be the same person she was before that night. And what about Nancy? Some people spend their lives wondering what they would do if pushed to the edge. Nancy Ben no longer had to wonder. In a rare interview, she was asked one final question. If you could go back, would you do it again? She didn't hesitate. Her answer was simple. I don't know. Not yes, not no, because maybe in that moment logic hadn't mattered. Maybe in that moment there had only been pain. Her case would be studied for years. Some would call her a cautionary tale, others would call her something else. A wife, a mother, a murderer. The world had made its judgment, but the question remained, what would you have done? Subscribe to our channel to get updated on similar crime stories just like this one. Together we can become voices of the voiceless.